That's right. It was the time when he came up with the color-coded alert system. You know, there was the yellow, which was kind of mellow, then orange, red, be very scared. And it was a way to keep people in a constant state of fear. So Code Pink was kind of a play on that color-coded alert system.
Hello, I'm Stanley Heller, and this is the 500th edition of the Struggle Video News, TSVN. We've been on every week for 10 years. We started with occasional programs in the run-up to Bush's shock and awe, and then in the fall of 2003, we started weekly programming. And all that time, I think we've only had one repeat. We're on 21 cable stations, on the internet at thestruggle.org, and on YouTube at Struggle Video Media. That's our channel where we actually get most of our views. Today, in addition to current news, we'll take a look back at our decade of programming. We begin with a rally in New York City on the day that Bradley Manning, who now calls herself Chelsea Manning, was sentenced to 35 years in prison. Manning has released lots of top secret information, documents and video to WikiLeaks. Some of it, activists say, shows evidence of U.S. war crimes and entitles Manning to designation of whistleblower. We end the program with an autobiographical interview with Medea Benjamin of Code Pink, how she changed her name, how Code Pink was started, and why she held back for years on Palestine, but then became an important activist on that subject. We begin in Times Square in New York City.
They would get 0 years. No time. Compared to Bradley Manning. Who blew the whistle. On U.S. war crimes. This is an outrageous sentence. Those of us who were at this trial. And all of you. Who watch from around the world. Know that justice was not done. The war criminals. Who led. Who legally justified. Carried out the war crimes in Iraq. Are free. They're highly paid. They're respected. Like David Petraeus. Who has a new job at CUNY. Like Bob Gates. Who was Obama's defense secretary. These people are free. While Bradley Manning's been locked up. We are.
And now for a look back. We'll start with a show that took place just after Bush invaded Iraq. Demonstration in New York City against the war. And then some footage from Rafah that occurred actually in 2002. Some brave ISM volunteers trying to stop bulldozers from demolishing Palestinian homes. Rachel Corey of Washington State was an ISM volunteer who went to Rafah in 2003. On March 16th of that year, she was run over and killed by an Israeli military bulldozer. A few months later, her parents spoke at UConn, and here's a snippet from an interview.
Well, of course, our daughter Rachel Corey was killed there by a Israeli bulldozer on March 16th of this year, and we needed to go to Rafah, where she was killed, and walk where she walked, see who she saw, talk to the people that she talked to, visit the homes and the families in the homes where she had visited. So a lot of it was almost a pilgrimage.
Now, an interview in 2006 with Layla Al-Haddad about sonic boom attacks in Gaza. I understand there's something with sonic booms that they do deliberately.
Yes, that was another tactic that was used after the disengagement that has since ceased because of intense pressure from human rights organizations, which shows just how important it is to exert this pressure. It's not to no end. The sonic booms, basically low-flying, low-altitude fighter jets would fly over the city, a densely populated city, mind you, the eerie thing about, and so they emit these shock waves, and so they're called sonic boom attacks. And usually sonic booms are actually illegal over populated cities. They're illegal in this country. Israeli pilots told me that they're illegal over Tel Aviv and other cities in Israel because of the damage that they incur. And they weren't used before disengagement because there were still settlers living in Gaza and they could be injured. In addition to bodily harm to the ears, they shatter windows and literally just completely blow off doors from their hinges. And they're eerie because they happen usually in the middle of the night and still, and you don't hear what's happening. And all of a sudden, because it's faster, it's supersonic, so it's faster than the speed of sound, you just hear this immense sound, and it's as if a blanket of air literally just knocks you down, and then you hear the plane flying. And after intense pressure was causing severe trauma and miscarriages, and it went to the Israeli High Court, and they said we can't rule on this because it's a security matter, which is the usual response. But it eventually ceased, I think, under that pressure.
In 2007, TSVN went to Palestine. Here we have an interview with a man whose wife was killed as he was backing his car away from an Israeli checkpoint.
بين خراس وبين صريف.
I was traveling from the village of Kharas to the village of Sorif, and the checkpoint was between the villages of Kharas and Sorif.
وبعدين عند الحاجز أنا وقفت عنده إلا الجندي بقول لي ارجع ما فيش طريق.
When I stopped by the checkpoint, the Israeli soldiers told me, go back, there is no way from here, you cannot enter.
رجعت أنا الحين من عند الحاجز بعد ما بعدت عنه نص كيلو بلش بيطخ.
Then I started backing back, and after I was about half kilometer away from the checkpoint, they started shooting at us.
وأنا يعني لما أجت الإصابة إلي انصبت أنا ومرتي. هي جت هوتها الإصابة من عندها بالرأس وأنا أخذت الإصابة من الخلف.
My wife was shot in the head, and I was shot in my back. And what happened then, the Israeli investigation, the Israeli army apologized for this. أبو هاني أعطوك أي تعويض مالي على القصة؟ صار لك أي تعويض؟ any compensation about this?
بس اللي يعني العلاجات والمستشفى دفعوها.
They didn't compensate me anything, but they paid my entry to the hospital for that incident specifically.
We happened to be in Ramallah at the last big release of Palestinian political prisoners. From 2008, a comment by renowned activist Mazen Qunsiya.
Dunkin' Donuts canceled an ad that involved the showing of a famous woman by the name of Rachel Ray wearing this scarf around her neck. And the reason they gave is because they received some complaints from right-wing conservatives and neocon Zionists who complained about Rachel Ray promoting terrorism by wearing this scarf. For the record, the history of this scarf is that it was a headdress that's worn by Palestinians, which you can see in this painting, for example, of a Palestinian man. It's worn by all Arab people. The men wear it as you see here. The women wear a similar thing to cover their hair. So it's a sign of modesty, and it goes back thousands of years. It's related to Arab culture. It has little to do with violence or anything to do with violence. It is just simply a headscarf and a head dressing. And the reality of it is that we wear it now around the world. In Europe, they wear it all the time as a fashion statement and a sign of solidarity with the Palestinian people and with the Arab people who are facing oppression and colonial rule. So we encourage everybody to wear this scarf, kafiyya, as a scarf or as a headdress if they choose, but at least as a scarf to show their solidarity with the oppressed people of the Middle East and to show that this is not an association with terrorism.
TSVN went to Occupy Wall Street on its very first day. This video went viral and was seen over 1 million times, and part of it was even put on the national program, The View. Those were heady days before all levels of U.S. government conspired to destroy Occupy Wall Street. Finally, attorney Bruce Fein gives a spirited attack on the presidential use of military drones.
And there is no accountability beforehand, afterwards, or otherwise. We have no idea whether anybody of the 4,000 killed was engaged in hostilities or otherwise. It's just, trust me, I never get it wrong. Well, that is the opposite of the rule of law. There is no trial. Remember, one of the indictments against King George III that provoked the Americans to overthrow the British was he denied us the right to jury trial. Jury trial? When the Predator drones, jury trial, you don't get any trial at all. None whatsoever. Due process, the recognition you get it wrong. Where is the check and balance? There's no congressional oversight. There are not even any written guidelines how you get on the list, how you get off the list. There's no judicial involvement before or after the fact. We as a people, are we proud that we kill people with such recklessness?
We've been featuring Medea Benjamin's New Haven speech on our program lately. While she was in the area, I did this interview with her and found out how a Long Island girl named Susie became a major anti-war leader. I'm speaking with Medea Benjamin, the well-known activist, and I wanted to ask a bit about her biography. When you changed your name, let's start with that.
I grew up on Long Island, New York, Jewish family, in the suburbs, not a political family at all. My name was Susan, but I was always small, so I was Little Susie. And somehow I didn't like being Little Susie. When I went off to college at 18, I started reading the Greek tragedies, and I decided I wanted to change my name, and every month I would take a different name from one of the Greek tragedies. And I really liked the name Medea. I had read two versions of that play, and one version said, she killed her children. The other version said she was a strong woman with magical powers, and so they blamed that on her. And I thought, aha, I'm going to redeem this name. And I just thought it was a pretty name. And I also thought at that point that it would be good if when people turned 18, they took their own names, as part of becoming independent and
You
adult.
ever see 1,000 Clowns?
No.
That's exactly what happens in that movie. They said the boy, he says you can call yourself anything you want, but at 6 or something like that, you have to pick your own name. It's a Jason Robards, but I digress. So you picked.
So I picked the name Medea, and I used it ever since I was 18.
So when did you get political, as they say?
I got political in high school. It was during the Vietnam War. My sister's boyfriend went off to Vietnam, a really sweet guy, and 6 months later sent her home the ear of a Viet Cong as a necklace. And I was so shocked by it that I decided I wanted to do something to make sure that people didn't think other human beings' body parts were a souvenir.
So you got involved in some anti-Vietnam groups, perhaps?
I started an anti-war group on campus. I started campaigning for an anti-war candidate in Congress. I learned all the anti-war songs I could and played guitar, and I was...
This is middle 60s, let's say? Or?
Yes, yes. So definitely the Vietnam War shaped my worldview.
And then when Vietnam ended, you continue with political stuff?
I did. I went off to college, joined SDS. After 6 months in college, I thought, this doesn't make sense to pay money to sit in a classroom that's like a jail cell. I think I'll drop out and go see the world. And I did, and I traveled for about 4 years with a backpack and an extra pair of pants, and saw a lot of the world.
Yeah. And then you worked for the UN at some point?
And then I got a great education traveling around the world. By 4 years later, I spoke 5 languages. I had learned a lot of skills along the way. I ended up working for the UN in Africa, and I worked in many countries in Latin America, and spent about 10 years outside the United States, and then came back here in the early 80s.
And when does global exchange fit in?
Started Global Exchange as a way to give Americans the opportunity I had, which is to take them out of the country and let them see the U.S. through other eyes, because I thought it was so important for Americans to see other societies, other ways of doing things, and reflect on our own society. So started Global Exchange in the late 80s, and we also got involved around economic justice issues, the fair trade labeling that was starting in Europe. We brought that system to the United States, the fair trade labels that you now see on coffee and tea, chocolate, and got involved around sweatshop issues, the World Trade Organization, free trade agreements, all those economic justice issues.
Did you go out to Seattle in the late 90s?
I was sitting in our organization at Global Exchange when we were planning what to do about the World Trade Organization, and said, let's shut it down. And from there was very involved in the whole plan to shut down the WTO.
And then you ran for Senate. Did you win?
I didn't win. I got about 350,000 votes, which was great, but it was also a great thing to do in California, because we decided to use the campaign to build a lot of Green Party locals, and also to connect a lot of the issues that were happening around the state. At that point, a lot of issues around the electricity fraud that was being committed by big companies, so environmental issues, and issues around public financing of campaigns, corporate domination, the free trade agreements, and war and peace issues.
And this is the year 2000?
Yes.
And then we start getting closer to war. Let's talk about 2001. Do you recall where you were that day, September 11th?
Yeah, I was in San Francisco. I had just taken my partner to the airport, and he called from the airport and said, turn on the TV. And so many of our lives changed, and my life totally changed then, because I felt compelled to stop doing the work around the economic justice issues, which was very hard to do because we had so much momentum. We were making great changes that affected the lives of large numbers of workers in places like China and Vietnam, Indonesia. And yet it just seemed like I knew our government was going to take revenge that was going to lead to the death of a lot more innocent people, and ended up starting Code Pink and have been involved around the post 9/11 issues ever since.
Now, our viewers may have already forgotten the business of the codes, but when Bush was in there, they started talk about what those codes were.
Well, that's right. It was the time when he came up with the color-coded alert system. You know, there was the yellow, which was kind of mellow, then orange, red, be very scared. And it was a way to keep people in a constant state of fear. So Code Pink was kind of a play on that color-coded alert system.
Who were, beside yourself, who were some of the people who started it?
Well, actually, it started at an environmental retreat for women. So there were all kinds of women, like the great shrimper from Texas, Diane Wilson, the wonderful pagan leader, Starhawk, Jody Evans, my partner, who stayed with me in doing this, from Los Angeles. There were women that worked back in those days on building community gardens. There were just a great assortment of women. We came up with it during an afternoon break, and most people just thought it was a joke and we weren't serious about it, but a couple of us ended up going to Washington, D.C., and the first major protest was Diane Wilson and myself going to the hearing of Donald Rumsfeld when he was justifying the war in Iraq. And we didn't even know they were public hearings at the time, but we made our banners and we tucked them into our pantsuits and walked in like we were journalists and got seated right behind Donald Rumsfeld and all of these generals. And in the middle of the hearing popped up and said, we want UN inspections, not war, because, oh, I forgot to mention, one of the first things we did is we took a delegation to Iraq, and we met with the inspectors and saw them saying that there were no weapons of mass destruction. So when we did that first protest in Congress, it got worldwide attention, and then we had all kinds of people saying, I want to join Code Pink, I want to join Code Pink, and it blossomed from there.
Now, one thing, if I'm correct, that you weren't involved with was Israel for a long time. Could you talk about that?
Israel, you know, I helped to start an organization called the Global Exchange, and there we did some work around Israel and Palestine, particularly taking groups to the West Bank. But I stayed out of it mostly because it was the one issue in my family that was very hard to approach, and I thought, there's so many other issues that I can get involved in. I'll leave that to other people. But it was really at the 2006 invasion of Lebanon that I said, I can't stay on the sidelines anymore.
And you've been to Gaza, you've been on the Freedom Flotilla, you were a big organizer in the Freedom March.
Yes, I went to Lebanon during the 2006 Israeli invasion and got very heavily involved in Middle East work in general. We started a campaign to boycott the cosmetic company Ahava that makes its products in the settlements. Involved in several of the flotillas, yes, the Gaza Freedom March, and took about 8 delegations to Gaza, in which we did some wonderful projects like building playgrounds. We were accused when we got back of building playgrounds for the children of Hamas and threatened with arrest. And we made a lot of hay about that in Congress, bringing the pictures of the children swinging on the swings and say, you know, arrest us if you must. But we have been going back to Gaza many times and to the West Bank.
Well, we could talk a lot more. This is really interesting, but I think we have to close, so I appreciate this interview.
Thank you very much, Dan.
So now we start our next 500 programs. That's it for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.